So I'm Melissa Noble, the interim managing director of Cynthia Woods Mitchell Center. And this discussion is one of the programs associated with the 2021 Artists in Residence Spotlight exhibit at the Blaffer Art Museum, which includes two other of our artists in residence, Marisa Moranjan and Brandon Ballinger. The Artists in Residence program is one of the many supported by the Cynthia Woods Mitchell Center on the main campus of University of Houston, which includes scholarships, fellowships, performances, exhibitions, and scholarly research. Through these programs, we convene students, faculty, artists, and community members to work as interdisciplinary catalysts and collaborators that stimulate dialogue to bridge boundaries, share knowledge, and innovate experimental art. I'd like to introduce my co-director now, Stephen Matissio, the director and head curator of Blaffer Art Museum, as well as the artistic director of Cynthia Woods Mitchell. And he will introduce you to our panelists and the discussion for tonight.
All right, thank you so much, Melissa, and welcome to both our panelists as well as our audience members. And I just want to, before giving biographical introductions to the panelists, I wanted to briefly mention that the exhibition, as Melissa mentioned, will be on display until April 25th. And really one of the cornerstone elements is the presentation of Shaun's very calm and yet provocative prompt that asks your first interaction with law enforcement. This piece is presented on the exterior of the School of Art building, as well as on the interior of the Blaffer Art Museum. And in both locations, it is accompanied by a QR code in which we encourage all of the visitors that view this piece to click the code and submit their stories. And these stories are recorded anonymously, and then we take each one and we add it to a growing constellation within the museum. But even when the exhibition ends, the exterior prompt will remain on view until the end of May. And we encourage you to continue to participate because Shaun continues to accumulate these as a growing archive of human stories. And really, I feel that Shaun has explained it in a really provocative way and really poignant way in saying that our first encounter with law enforcement is oftentimes the foundational cornerstone in which all other interactions are related to either affirming or negating that initial interaction. And so we want to use that as one of the cornerstones of the discussion this evening. And so it is with great pride that I introduce our three panelists. I'm going to begin with Marvin Pierre, who is the executive director of 8 Million Stories, a nonprofit founded in 2017 to support youth in Houston and transform the lives of vulnerable individuals aged 16 to 21 through education, skills, training, employment, and authentic relationships. Prior to joining 8 Million Stories, Marvin was selected as a Bridge Fellow with the New Teacher Project. He has also served as the assistant principal at KIPP Polaris Academy for Boys in Houston and Dean of Students at Excellence Boys Charter School in Brooklyn, New York. He holds a BA in economics from Trinity College and a master's in education administration and supervision from the University of Houston. Speaking of University of Houston, Dr. Elwyn C is the University of Houston Vice President of Neighborhood and Strategic Initiatives, where he focuses on developing a more inclusive campus at all levels, enhancing diversity, and expanding access for talented, underrepresented individuals. He has degrees from Phillips Academy in Andover, Yale College, and Yale Law School. And after a 3-year stint at the Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering law firm in Washington, D.C., Dr. Lee joined the University of Houston Law Center, where he taught employment law, personal injury law, administrative law, and ethics. Dr. Lee served with distinction as chair of several Texas and Houston Bar Association committees on his way to becoming the first African-American tenured law professor in 1984. He has served as the interim director of the UH African American Studies program and vice president for student affairs at UH from 1991 to 2011. And our leader for this evening, Shaun Leonardo. He is a Brooklyn-based artist from Queens, New York City. He received his MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute and has received support from Creative Capital, the Guggenheim Social Practice, Art for Justice, and a Blade of Grass. His work has been featured at the Guggenheim Museum, the High Line, and New Museum, and his solo exhibition, The Breath of Empty Space, began last year at Mass MoCA and is currently on display at the Bronx Museum. Shaun's multidisciplinary work often involves workshops, collaboration, and participatory practices as he provides a platform for voices to be heard and stories to be shared in a variety of languages. Shaun, I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you so much, Stephen. And it is an honor to share this virtual space with the two of you who have gotten to know just a bit, but particularly two Black men dedicated to youth development, dedicated to opening up the possibilities for young folks, even amidst the struggle, even amidst the backdrop of trauma, and particularly in the context of Houston, where George Floyd grew up. In the context of Houston, where George Floyd's mural was just disgraced. In the context and politics of the moment we live in which we are grieving and moving into mourning for the loss of someone like George Floyd, a father, a human being, even with the possibility opening up of Officer Derek Chauvin being indicted, and wavering between the two, wavering between the mourning and possibility. And so to ground us in this conversation, particularly since so much effort was put into criminalizing George Floyd during the trial and prior to the trial, I'd like us to start with the same prompt that Stephen spoke to, that has a presence there at the University of Houston, and for us to be generous enough to share our own personal narrative in relation to your first interaction with law enforcement. Would either of you like to volunteer to go first?
Well, I'll go first. I grew up in Houston in 3rd Ward, adjacent to the CUNY homes where George Floyd grew up. My classmates were from the CUNY homes and went to Yates. But when I was in elementary school, and this was very segregated times in the early 60s. So you didn't encounter, quote, white people at all, pretty much. It was that segregated. And you didn't go downtown, you didn't do any of that. You just stayed in your little world. And as a elementary school kid, you didn't have a car, you weren't gonna leave. And everything you had and needed was right there. But one day, my brother and I, we decided we were gonna go across Main Street, which was just a few blocks away. And it was what you might imagine, it was Main Street. And as we approached it and got ready to cross, and that would be going to the west, policeman approached us and said, "Where you boys going?" And I forget what our response was, but I recall he quickly informed us, "No, you won't be going across there. You need to just turn around." And he said it with a very angry, menacing tone. And we, quickly ran back to where we came from, and it left a mark on me to this day. It kind of brought home to me that there was places outside my 3rd Ward that I couldn't go and I wasn't welcome. Because prior to that, my thought was I just couldn't, I didn't have the means to go there. And I knew it was more than that. It was more than that, much more than that. That was my first experience.
Thank you, Dr. Lee.
Yeah, I think thinking back to my first interaction with the police, I grew up in a community in New York City called South Jamaica, Queens. And I'm also the proud son of 2 Haitian immigrant parents, right? And so up until the age of 10, my parents really shielded me from a lot of the crime and violence that occurred in our community. And, once I got older, started having a little bit more independence. And I remember, I grew up on this street corner on the block with about 7 of my closest friends. And one of my one of the friends of mine had recently got a car, right? His brother had gifted him a car. He turned 16, and so you can drive in New York City. And so the car that he had gotten was a BMW, right? So his brother essentially passed down the car to him. And so, I remember we used to just make it our thing to just go to the nearby mall and just kind of like drive around. And, the goal is to try to pick up as many girls as you can, right? And so nice car, trying to pick up, best girl you can find. And, while we're doing that, one of the cops pulled us over, and it was in the evening time. And I just remembered, like, before the cop even got to the car, my friend just rattled off certain things he wanted me to do. He's like, make sure your seatbelt's on. He was like, look straight ahead. Don't say nothing. Anything they ask, yes, sir, no, sir. And these were things that were passed down to him from his brother, because his brother also knew that when he gifted that car, what could come with that, right? What are some potential challenges and experiences that his brother's going to experience driving that car as a young Black male in a community, right? Because the assumption that many people will make that the only way you obtain a car like that is by selling narcotics. And so as the cops approaching, no reason for why they pulled us over, license and registration, also immediately asked us to step out of the car, pop the trunk. Ultimately nothing was found, but for me, it left a mark for me similar to Dr. Lee, in just terms of like, how do you operate when you see the police? And there's so many other moments that have happened in my life where I was either in the car and we got pulled over, or most recently, about a year ago, where my students who were leaving school from 8 Million Stories were approached by 7 squad cars and guns drawn out on my kids. And the only reason why my kids are still alive today was because of my ability to stay emotionally constant and communicate effectively with the police officers, as my kids are in a rage because they were, wrongfully profiled. And so the challenges in that, I think stem from when I was 10 years old and just realizing, how do you communicate with police? And I've never lost sight of, like, how do you, regardless of the situation, the goal is to go home, right? And I remember my friend saying that to me when we got back in the car. He was like, at the end of the day, we want to go home. And I never forgot that.
Could I comment on that for a minute? Like there've been other experiences that I've had. And then just as you were talking about your students, as my son was growing on, I had to give him the talk, about what to do. And one of the reasons I never bought him a car, I loaned him the most beat up car I could find, was try to reduce the number of times he would be stopped. I knew I couldn't eliminate it. And of course, he got stopped several times for no reason. And when I was talking to him about that, after that, he looked at me very angrily and he said, that was your generation. I'm not going down like that. I'm not doing what you're asking me to do. And he had this angry look in his eye, and it was very chilling, because I could just imagine looking at how angry he looked. How might a policeman react to him, even though he may be right in that he wasn't stopped for any reason, knowing what we know and what we've seen. And then there was nothing I could do about that attitude he had. And yet I understood his attitude. He said, that was your generation. I'm not doing that. So I want to share that.
Absolutely. And I see that reactiveness in my own young people that I work with on a daily basis. And it's that righteous anger is frightful.
It is.
Absolutely. And then, it's difficult for me as someone that wants to help them preserve their own life.
Right.
To deny that rage.
Yeah.
And both of your stories resonate with me in my own reflection on a first interaction. And to be very honest, I can't pinpoint a first experience because so much of what comes to mind was environmental. What I can remember most was the patrolling in my neighborhood. And I was joking with Stephen and Melissa early on another car that there was a ongoing, quote unquote, inside joking in the community in which, there were a pair of detective officers that always used the same yellow cab to patrol our neighborhood. So everyone knew the license plate. And so it was a bit of information that was transferred over to every young person in their neighborhood to be alert for this particular cab. And then compounded by the experience of, at an early age, my brother rushing home with that rage, with that uncontrollable unsettledness, because a detective officer had pulled over, pushed him up against the wall, and pulled a gun out on his head because he touched his beeper. And right around that same time frame, my brother, same brother, taking me aside because, like you, Dr. Lee, my father handed me a beat up car when I got my learner's permit, so to reduce the risk of receiving too much attention. And my brother setting me aside and walking me through all the steps of not if, when I got pulled over. Putting the keys on the dash, putting my hands turning down the volume, lowering down the window, putting my hands on the dash in successive order, articulating in his own way, as you said, Marvin, just get home. Your duty is to get home. And realizing then, as I do now, as I see it in our young people, the way that composure, the way that alertness diminishes our own humanity, belittles our sense of self, because survival supersedes our personhood. And so I begin here because, as a way to ground this conversation, I don't want to dwell in the ways in which that initial experience ingrained within us how to move with safety, how it may have initiated a distrust of power and authority. Instead, I want to ground us in this prompt as a way to speak to how it has influenced our philosophies and methodologies of working with Black and Brown youth. How that interaction with law enforcement has an impact on how we choose to see and come back to our young people time and time again, to think about possibility in their lives as a way of challenging that fear that really is created from that very first instance. And I tell people all the time, all it takes is that one time for us not to know if we are safe around law enforcement. All it takes is that initial moment. And so again, I want to invite all of us to think about how this translates into our work in life now. What are the ways in which you bring youth into your work, into your space? What is the philosophy and methodology in your practices? Maybe we'll start with you, Marvin.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when we started the 8 Million Stories program, one of the things that we were very much so intentional about is meeting kids where they are and removing the assumptions that often people make when you are working with disconnected youth, right? When you get a profile of a young person that may have come out of the criminal justice system or has been kicked out of several schools, traditionally, and just the way we are and how we operate now, a lot of assumptions are made about that student that you're, essentially meeting or reviewing their profile. And you're making all these assumptions that this person is either troublemaker, can't be helped, can't there's no level of intervention that can take place with that young person. And I know we would not be successful today if we didn't adopt that mindset of meeting kids where they are and removing the assumptions that often come because of their past. And I will tell people, and I often do this in every opportunity I have to talk about our young people, is that despite their educational experiences and where they may have gone in terms of experience with the justice system, our young people are extremely bright and can really immediately just see whether you are genuinely interested in helping them write this path. Like the moment that they sit in front of you and the first, I guess, 10 words out your mouth, a young person can assess if you are actually really speaking your truth. And we've had several incidents, and I find those moments most often with my young men that come in and really are the same way I'm assessing them, they're assessing me. Like, is this someone I want to be very honest with and forthcoming about what I'm doing? In the same way, I'm also trying to get the insight on what I need to do from a program perspective to ensure that this young person gets the support that they need to be able to be successful in life. And so, I think it goes back to, those experiences that we see when people are pulled over, right? Cops are pulling over Black and brown males because there's assumptions that come with that, right? You're profiling me because you don't believe I have the financial means to drive a nice car. You don't believe I belong in this community because I don't have the financial means to do so, right? And so there's a lot of assumptions that lead to, why many of our young people, especially our young men, are profiled today. And oftentimes you see a lot of community organizations and schools make the same mistake of, imposing some of those biases and assumptions on our young people. And I think that's where we're falling short in terms of really trying to make the right levels of intervention with the young people we serve today. And this new generation that, just like to Dr. Lee's point is saying, that's how it happened, back then. Like, I'm going to do my own thing, right? And they're doing that with no guidance and no additional support from the community, which is problematic.
I forgot what the question you asked, but I remember what I was going to say in response to it. So you tell me if it's responsive to your question. I think it has to do with what you tell kids and how that first experience and others similar like that affected you. As I'm answering, I'm thinking of fear and I'm thinking of fairness. And I think when you're dealing with people who've experienced fear, legitimate fear and fairness, you have to acknowledge the reality of that fear. I don't want to give them the impression that that fear isn't justified, but so often it is, because we see too many stories. And so now there's fear and you run, or there's fear and you have already anticipated how you're going to courageously deal with that situation. And I tell people I've been teaching a long time, and I consider basically everything I do in mentoring a form of teaching. And I've had many students of color telling me about this degree of fairness, and I've had that in my own educational journey. And the question is always not whether there's fear or unfairness, because at the times I'll acknowledge, yes, that exists. The question is, what are you going to do and what is your goal? And I challenge people to be selfish in that moment and to think about what your goal is. In a fear situation, your goal is get home that day, not to win an argument with a man that has a gun, typically a man who has a gun. You get home, you can win the argument later. And in areas of fairness, I can remember teaching law students, and they would come in and talk about unfairness, and at times there was some truth to that. And I said, what is your ultimate goal? To graduate. Let's talk about what you need to do that. And some of them, I can remember one time a student said, well, I'm going to sue. I said, you haven't got your law degree yet. And I'm going to get a lawyer. I said, you got any money? I said, I'm going to get someone to take this on pro bono. come back to me when you find one who's going to do that. And after you've done all of that, I said, now ask yourself this question. Has anyone who looked like you confronted what you've confronted and been successful? I've been here a long time. The answer is yes. And I can tell you what to do and how to achieve your goal. Because we as a people, you go back, we've always confronted unfairnesses and obstacles. The question was, how are we going to achieve the ultimate goal? We're going to go over it. We're going to go around it. We got enough power. We can go through it. So I kind of teach from that perspective rather than for people to feel sorry for themselves or to strike out and lose out on their ultimate goal. You know, when you lose sight of your ultimate goal, you might do something you might regret.
I mean, what I'm hearing in both of you is like, what is the approach in embedding within a young person that has seen nothing but impossibilities, nothing but barriers? How do you instill within a person that there's a long game? That what you see now as an impossibility might actually lead you to something greater. And I always think about, you know, how Ta-Nehisi Coates has framed this conversation in terms of the beautiful struggle, in which that trauma, that hurt, those very real lived experiences of fear don't necessarily go away. But how do you use that as fuel?
Yeah.
How do you acknowledge that and still every fucking day still show up and try to live a full life? Now, what I encounter, what I would say, and I think what I'm about to say situates well between what you've both offered. What continues to move me in this work is the way in which that fear, based on real lived experience, and distrust, based on, as you say, Marvin, people that don't really show up with care and accountability, how when internalized, a young person starts to believe in those messages that they are worthless. And in regards to the criminal justice space, which I also operate within, those messaging often equate with criminality. And what I always say this when addressing my work, what continues to both sadden me but not surprise me is the way in which young people walk into through recess's doors and are already self-prescribing as criminal, almost believing that an arrest was just a matter of time. And so we tried to deduce all the ways in which they've received those messages that their lives are less than, not of value. And that happens certainly with those first interactions with law enforcement, but also with all those other social spaces, whether it's education, the home, the streets, where they are diminished, again, where their humanities are rendered less than or invisible. And so in my practice, what we do is address that directly. And now we utilize the arts, of course, but I think it's important in acknowledging the fear and acknowledging the distrust and acknowledging all those barricades to seeing possibility, that you have to start with an undoing. That it's, yes, all the systems is in play, but it's also the ways in which a young person arrives and not seeing themselves in fullness. In other words, that they've internalized these messages so deeply that so much of the work needs to go in restoring their own sense of self, in restoring their sense of humanity, so that, again, they know that they are not defined by any one experience with arrest and incarceration, that they are not defined by that interaction with law enforcement. They are not defined by those messages that dictate that they are less than. And so the leap then becomes, how do you address that trauma? How do you begin to restore that sense of humanity? And then what? And then what? Because I think we will all acknowledge that we can't, as individuals, set up a person, anyone, for, let's use the word success at this point. That those challenges will persist. And so my next question to y'all is, in the work that we do, in this restoration, in this belief, in this powering through with a young person, what comes next? Because those systems at play will still be there. And so how do you define success and failure in the lives of the young people you work with?
You know, there have been studies that show you can take young kids, and because of the portrayal in the media and things that they see, very young age, and you put a picture of a black guy and a white guy. I've seen these, and you ask them which one is the bad guy. And very innocent little kids will pick the black guy. And that they could be from a home with, you know, very proud ethnic parents and all that, and still that would be the case. And it just shows you how pervasive the culture sends out these messages. So when you talk about reversing things, there's a lot to reverse. And then when you go to schools and you know how young black boys are viewed and that kind of thing. It's a lot to reverse. It's a lot to reverse. But if you aren't intentional about it, I don't think you have much of a chance to do that. There's a Brookings Institute report that came out. It was about black males and boys. And they made the point in this study that you can't just focus on black students. You don't focus on males of color, you're going to miss the boat. And they go through a whole analysis and statistics and psychological reasons why that's the case. But it's very, very compelling because young males get kind of messed up very early, very, very early. And with each phase, they get further and further behind and left out and kicked out and discarded, and everything else flows from there. A classic example is I remember when my son was in school, and you know, the lower grades are mostly female. Not that that's bad or good or anything, but it depends. And it'd be nice to have males there, but they weren't there in any numbers. And then I knew that I could tell what kind of female was teaching my son based on what was going on. If he was in a classroom where the teacher had boys, he had fewer problems. Not that he didn't have any, but he had fewer. If he had a teacher who had no boys, that teacher didn't seem to understand the extra energy that young boys tend to have, just being boys, let alone boys of color. And so the negative things flow from that ignorance, you know, negative labels and consequences to those labels, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have to be intentional and aware to change around that perspective. We do in the Black community a better job of educating our young girls than we do our boys. We do a better job of giving them a good self-image. I think young boys don't see the variety of positive images of Black, I'm using Black in this case, males, as say the girls would with respect to female adults. There's many more. I often tell when I'm speaking to parents, I say, we group raise our girls. I'm not sure we raise our boys at all. that we tend to give them balls, or we look out there and we're happy if they're kicking balls. And with our girls, they got friends of their mother, they got different groups, and the experience of a young girl where you have 6 or 7 females, adults, pouring into them, whatever it is. And the typical boy doesn't have that. They're out there with that ball. The whole culture that we have, you know, I often think this, when I saw this growing up, it seems like somewhere there's an invisible mandate for boys to strive to be a man, whereas girls just have to get to be 18, they're a woman. But boys don't get that accolade without doing something. So I remember thinking, well, what defines a man? Well, in this society, I'm gonna distill it in my view. First thing is economic power. You know, we always had the phrase, the man, you had money, you were a man. I think if you're a young boy and you have access to money, you still feel manly because you got the juice. You can make some things happen, you know? The second way manhood is defined by physical strength, muscles, athletic prowess, even fighting. And the third way is sexual prowess. And so I noticed when I was growing up, the kids who were the poorest, to achieve some sense of manliness, they would be pumping iron, building up their muscles, you know, trying to be athletes, fighting. And they were viewed manly to the extent they were more physical. Kids with the money, they didn't try to do that. They didn't have to do that. They were already accorded that appellation. And then I saw very early on, you know, kids way before they should be engaging in sexual behavior. And if you follow that up, some of them in their teenage years and young adults, you know, felt that, you know, the more girls I had sex with or the more girls they knocked up, they felt more manly. And some people could even articulate that kind of stuff, which is, you know, sad. The other thing that is dysfunctional in our definition of manliness in the culture that impacts boys of color in the wrong way, in a bad way, is this whole thing about male independence. We always make jokes that, you know, men don't want advice and all, but the whole culture said, don't ask for advice. If you're a young boy, you know, don't ask for help. Do that yourself. Don't ask for help. It's what I call a Superman Lone Ranger, Clint Eastwood. You look at the Clint Eastwood movies, he's always saying, I don't need any help. You know, he's playing a detective and the captain says, you need to have, I don't want a partner. And if they get a partner, they only allowed one. And even in sports, the people who have been lionized in sports are the guys who are great individually so much. You know, like Michael Jordan, he could take it off the dribble, or Allen Iverson. Just give him the ball and he'll do it by himself. And so we grow up saying we don't grow up with that group concept or help. So you put all these things together, and you can see where a lot of dysfunctionality comes from that. Pour in a little testosterone and it really combustible. And I remember my son, fortunately, because he was my son and we had, you know, doing pretty well economically, he didn't have to worry about economics power, but you know, when you pour in that testosterone, you know, young kids want to be social. So he's putting a lot of time into trying to make the basketball team and all of that. And that meant he couldn't work on the school paper and so and so. And so I tried to figure out how I was going to try to steer him to study more, even though he was very bright. And so what I did was I said, I got to align his natural interests, which I understand, with my interests. And so I told him, tell you what, I know you want to socialize. I understand it. I've been there, done that, you know, and I know what that industrial strength teenage testosterone is like. So here's what we're gonna do. I said, if you bring home A's, you can have a hell of a social life, and I'll protect you against your mother. And that was the deal we cut. And he wanted that social life so badly, he brought home A's. And one weekend, I think it was Saturday morning, I got up in the little raggedy car I'd loaned him. Didn't give it to him, loaned him. Two of the wheels was on the front yard, and his wallet was in the front yard. So quickly snatched up the wallet, put the car back on the street, and ran upstairs to look at his report card. And I was so disappointed he had all A's. So disappointed. But anyway, I'm just saying that I can understand how some of the kids get off track, trying to, be a man when you don't have that money, which almost defines you as being manly without having to do anything. I better stop here. Anyway.
Yeah, I think for me, and I'll share a little bit about how I arrived at this understanding, is I think many of our boys, especially our Black boys growing up in most of our urban communities, suffer from something that I think we all at some point went through, is this inability to dream past what they see in their community. And, I think back to my experiences growing up in South Jamaica, Queens, where all that was around me was toxic. Drugs, violence, poverty, toxic. And on one side, I'm looking at that every single day I wake up. Look out the window, that's all I see. I walk to the bus stop on my way to school. I walk by the neighborhood, kind of like, homeless man, right? We call them jungle, right? And jungle, for me, did a lot of things for my life, right? One, he showed me the importance of being seen. And I think a lot of our kids in our school systems, in our community, are not seen. But he also was a reminder for me that if I didn't take my school's work seriously, where I could end up and how my life could end up. And I think what our boys are struggling with right now is that they don't have a contrast to what they're seeing every single day. If you want me to do the right things and I'm in an environment where there's nothing but negativity around me, how do I get to the other side? With no male influence, with no person that looks like me that has actually walked the same walk that I'm walking and has overcome. We don't have enough of our boys interacting with men who look like them, come from where they come from, helping them get onto the other side. And I remember I ended up, I was a really good athlete in growing up. So I got a scholarship to go to a boarding school. I went to prep school. My Pop Warner football coach, Joe Marino, was an Italian guy in New York City that took inner city boys out of New York City and put them in these schools across the Northeast. And I ended up going to a prep school called Tabor Academy, where I serve now as a board of trustees in the Cape Cod. And for me, it did so much for my life, right? It took me out of an environment, not because I didn't want to be in South Jamaica, Queens, but I needed a contrast. Right? Because I was trying to be successful, but I didn't see the roadmap, right? What was the plan? How am I going to get to be successful instead of just aspiring to be a neighborhood hustler or to make it to the NFL, right? Because that's all our boys aspire to, because that's all they know. And that's what we define as success, what our culture defines as success. And it wasn't until I went to a prep school and my school realized I was struggling with the transition. I was struggling academically and I was struggling socially. I went from being the majority to the minority. It was only 8 Black kids that graduated in my graduating class. And of the 8, 6 of us were there for sports, right? And most of us were not even from the community. And so struggling with that transition, they reached out to one of the few African Americans, I wouldn't say only, one of the few African Americans in that town, and his name was Dr. McFadden, Dr. Sam McFadden. He ended up becoming my surrogate father, and the reason why I'm so passionate about young people, because what he did for me, he saw the promise in me when I didn't even see it in myself, right? And so when I remember the first day he picked me up at my dorm to kind of go hang out, that was our first time meeting, and he pulls up in a Mercedes Benz, and I get in the car and I look at him kind of funny, like, who is this guy? And older black guy, had white hair, but he was also from the Bronx. And he's playing this type of music, right? What ultimately is classical music. So I get in the car, I look at him funny because I said, the only people that drive Mercedes Benz in my neighborhood and where I come from are hustlers, right? I've never seen another black man who's professional driving that kind of car. And so I said, I get, boldly, not knowing anything better. I said, what do you do for a living? He says, I'm a radiologist. I'm the head radiologist for the local hospital in this town. I said, all right, cool. And then I also what are we listening to? He was like, classical music. And, it takes me to his house and I'm driving through the community and I'm looking at the homes, right? Because I've never seen homes that size, right? Coming from where I come from. And he can see that I'm looking at it and I'm in awe of what I'm seeing. And he said, you like that? You like what you see? I said, I do. He said, you can accomplish that too. From there, just to fast forward, it just put things in perspective, right? I went from wanting to be an athlete. And if that didn't work out, I could tap into, narcotics, right? To now I wanted to aspire to be a professional, a working professional, realizing I could actually have a career and drive the same car that people are risking their lives every day in my neighborhood to drive. And that changed my whole perspective. And not only did it do it for myself, I came back to the community and the same 7 guys that I grew up with started to see the shift in my mindset. Because what I was starting to learn how to do, and it's what I teach my kids at 8 Million Stories, because I've had to redefine what success looks like for them. It's not about giving them a GED or giving them a job, because they can easily go back to the couch and they're still stuck in the toxic environment, both physically and mentally. And so I have to teach them, and we were discussing this other day, now that we're serving an older group of kids, we have to teach them how to compartmentalize the things that are happening in their lives, because we're sending kids off to college, we're sending kids off to careers, but they still got some things that are attached to them, their families, right? You're not going to throw your family away because you're trying to do right? But with your family, and we all know when you're trying to make it out the hood, there's something always pulling you back. And it's sometimes your family, it's your neighborhood, it's your friends, and they have not learned how to break off of those attachments. And I said, they're not going to be successful in life unless they learn how to, this is what I'm focused on right now. And all of these other things, I'm going to get to them later, or I'm going to tend to them at a different time of the day or in life. And that's what I had to learn. When I went to college, in prep school, it didn't mean the issues and the poverty stopped. I just had to learn how to compartmentalize and be able to move forward on my personal goals, just like what Dr. Lee was saying about being selfish about what I wanted to accomplish for my life. I said, I got a chance to do something with my life. I got to put myself first now and move forward, and then be in a position to bring up my community and those that I love after I've reached a level of success. And, I think a lot of our kids are struggling with that. They don't have a contrast and they don't know how to compartmentalize.
That's an interesting story.
Thank you both. And with the time remaining, I want to both advance and problematize where we've landed in this conversation. For one, I want to be mindful and acknowledge that the fastest growing percentage of incarceration today is among young Black women, is young Black girls. And so when we talk about the limitations of the hood, when we talk about the impossibilities of seeing oneself outside of the current predicament, I want us to focus on not only manhood, but I want to focus on how communities see their own current realities, but don't necessarily see the systems at play. And so, for example, in the work that I do, it never surprises me anymore that while a young kid, both boy and girl, have caught a case, they don't necessarily know how the criminal justice system works. They don't necessarily know how the education system works. They don't necessarily know how the health system works. In other words, they only see their own realities, not in terms of limitations. They only see their own circumstances and realities because they do not, or they have not ever been exposed to the resources that they should have in the first place. And so this is what I mean by I want to problematize our conversation at this point, because in our cases, I will state firmly that this audience, this invisible audience, is witnessing a conversation amongst three successful Black men that at some point in our lives were forced, whether willingly or not, to see outside of outside of current predicaments, outside of current circumstances, because at some point in our lives, whether it was a mentor, whether it was a shift in possibility, whether it was some opening we saw, fuck, there are these resources over there that I want. But I want us to think about the notion or the question of those resources still being over there. Like, I need to access this outside of my community. And that recognition, when I see that in my young people, that recognition is paralyzing. It's scary. And so to define success for that person needs an entirely different framework, because the last thing I ever want to do is name possibility, name resources as something that necessarily exists outside of one's own Blackness, one's own heritage, one's own community. In other words, that possibility exists only by diminishing one's own sense of self and adopting some Eurocentric white view of success. And that's when it gets hard. That's when it gets difficult, because then if you adopt a different framework, what are you saying is success? And that's really where this question lies, because I want to make it very clear to my young people that I'm not invested in these Western notions of perfectionism, of greatness, of value. And yet I do understand what it means to gain resources outside of your own community. And so what do we do? In other words, what are we setting our young people up for? How do you look at those possibilities? How do you look at those? How do you name those resources for young people when they don't exist in their own community, but should have been there to begin with? And I know that this might feel abstract, but I feel like it's an important place for us to go.
Let me just a couple of comments. One, when I think about the CUNY homes, people talk about getting out of the CUNY homes. They talk about that, and it makes you wonder that shouldn't be what you have to do. You know, there should be things there, adjacent to there, and what have you. But that's how they talk about it. Even the people who were there and became successful, thinking of a UH alum now who was very successful, headed a major US corporation, and he talked about how he got out of there when some people, he went on they took a group of them downtown and took them into a building where they worked, and he looked out the window and saw that big downtown and the offices, and he said, you know, I want that. How do I get that? How do I get that environment like that? So it relates to what you said earlier. You know, you talked about how, you know, whether it's George Floyd or the other kids, they all have images of the successful athletes, and many of them will tell you that's what they want to be. And this contrast that Marvin talked about, he's absolutely right. If you can see and touch and feel a contrast that looks like you, and God, what a wonderful thing if someone who is that willing to put a little time into you to give you a roadmap, and that's a wonderful thing. And too many of our kids don't have that. You may not know this, but I spent 2 years in prep school. We were only 5 Black kids in the prep school, and there were no Black staff, no Black professors, any of that, none of the above. But I didn't have enough money to come home frequently at all. So I remember going with a friend to his house, and he was, I guess, defined by their standards as upper middle class. I went to this big house in Pelham, New York, and I said, pretty big. I had to try to ask myself, what is upper middle class? How do you define upper middle class? And I finally decided, well, the house is grander. You got to count the restrooms. The more restrooms you had, the grander the house. And another friend one time took me home again. I didn't have money to fly. It was up in Connecticut, Greenwich or something. And I went through counting the restrooms. He had 10. I said, oh, no, this is really huge. But anyway, having a vision of something greater than, seeing things that are greater than does allow you to dream of those things, even if it's not someone of your color that you see who has it. And that's important. And it makes you wonder. I feel like we as a community have failed our youth in the sense that we don't work as hard to give them these visions or bring people in front of them who have journeyed and been successful. We don't do that as much as we should. One of the most important things in my upbringing was there's right next to the University of Houston is Texas Southern University. In the early days, that's a kind of the educational and cultural center grew out of Texas Southern. So I was around people who worked at Texas Southern, and so I was able to encounter in the neighborhood people who had various professions and that kind of thing. And I was in one of the early Black Boy Scout troops. And I thought it was a great program because in the pursuit of, the Boy Scouts is really kind of like a gang. You got your colors, you got your uniforms, you got your rituals and all of that. And so it had all the kind of things you'd want, but in a positive way. You headed up a patrol, you learned some leadership skills, there was discipline. And as you pursue toward these badges, because why were you pursuing? Because if you got certain badges, someone said nice things about you, made you feel good, But they were different topics like journalism, or technology, or what have you. So even though you weren't thinking about that initially, you're really being exposed to people, because the people who would sign off on your completion were people who worked in those areas. And as I grew older and began to volunteer for the Scouts, I realized that even though the city of Houston and Houston area has the biggest and best Scout program in the country, there's a racial divide in the greater Sam Houston area. So you have lots of, let's for lack of a better word, non-Black troops, and there are many more. And then not as many Black troops. And even in those troops, with the except, well, I can't speak too broadly about that, but you don't have the infrastructure that some of the other troops would have. And part of that is, as I discovered, those other troops have many more fathers to participate in the troop, in addition to financial backers. They had resources and all that. and the fathers were more important than the other stuff. But in some of the Black troops, you might have two incredibly dedicated people doing multiple jobs, holding it together, sacrificing amazingly. And I thought about, why is that case? Why are there not more Black fathers or people participating? And as I remember saying, when I get older, I'm going to be one of those scout leaders. Now, I haven't been a scout leader. I've certainly supported the troops in different ways. And I began to reflect on how come I didn't carve out the time to do that? And I thought about it in a larger context, not just mine. And I think it's because, you know, men are defined by, you know, their success in terms of working and what have you. You know, I remember thinking when my kids are born, if my wife would just take care of me financially, I love taking care of kids. I'd just stay home and take care of the kids and then take in some others. But that she would probably look at me and say, what are you talking about? But so when a Black man wakes up in the morning, typical man, he's trying to figure out, how do I keep that money rolling in? And there are challenges that I believe Black men face that makes it more difficult for them to give the kind of time. And then there's few of us to even give it because of the mass incarceration and all that other stuff. And so you don't have the kind of robust troops that you had on the other side of town. And so a lot of kids wouldn't have that opportunity. And there's plenty of sports teams that you can participate in the schools and all of that. And I can remember growing up hearing people talk about, yeah, you learn this from sports and that's from sports. And I looked at that and I said, is that really true? Because what I saw is that that's totally depending on what kind of coach you had. And a lot of coaches just interested in winning and weren't imparting very much. And then other times, as I watch kids, it was just repetitious. You know, you weren't really learning different skills and that kind of thing, or adding all of that kind of stuff. So I seem to be rambling, but because I've been always searching for where's the magic sauce that we could develop to make this thing work, you know? And I look at the scouts now with what happened with all the lawsuits and all the scouts in general, not just Black scouts, but went from 6 million down to 2 million. And then they added girls, and that's great. But so it's pretty much a shell of itself now. In this local community, literally right across the street from the University of Houston is Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, and it has produced more Black Eagle Scouts than any troop in the country. And it's a great resource. They people who don't even go to that church can participate in the scout troop. And I talked about girls being group raised, some of them, you know, pretty much middle-class girls, but in a good, well-run scout troop, the boys they get to encounter different men who all are, if they got time to participate in the scouts, they're all making money one way or another, okay? And so they get to be exposed to these different attitudes and ways of making money and being economically viable. But those things are more rare. So we need to create things that do what we know need to be done. I see a lot of programs that are geared toward females, and I have a daughter. My daughter took full advantage of those, but I know some of the people that do some of these, and I would always ask them, I said, well, why don't you include males in that? And some of them would say, oh, I didn't think about that. I said, well, you know, we as a village have to help everybody, the girls, the boys. One example would be there's a young lady who went to our law school. She has an insurance company, so she decided she wanted to give back to the community. And she set up something called, I forget what it's called, it's something like She CEO or something like that. So what she does is goes out to elementary schools, invite female CEOs who have started their own little companies here locally. And she has these girls in elementary school teach them some rudimentary business concepts, and have them do some childlike business plans. But the most important thing is they plant the seed that you can be your own boss and start a business, and they get to see females that look like them who have been successful at an early age. And I challenged her. I said, you could do that for the boys in the school too, would be helpful. And sometimes they'll say, well, why don't the men do this? I said, I agree with you. Men ought to do it. But it's not a competition. It's kind of like in a family. You had a daughter and a son. And if you said the father should feed the son, if he wasn't doing it, if you were the mother, you're going to make sure he eats anyway. And it's kind of like that. I'm not saying men shouldn't do, they should always do more. Yes, sure. Absolutely. But in the meantime, we as a village, we need to make sure that everybody gets fed, that everybody gets exposed to successful people who figured out how to do it. And we have to be intentional about it. We have a lot of Greek organizations. They're very strong, but some of them, but they're more on one side than the other. And we ought to have these conversations and make it happen. Make it happen. Okay, shut up now.
Marvin?
Yeah, I think similarly, we've got to be intentional. And I think for me, as the executive director of 8 Million Stories, that is top of mind for me in anything that we're doing with our kids. We started our program in the Galton community. And, I realized that based on the kids that were coming to us, most of our kids were coming from Third Ward, Sunnyside. And I said, this is not where we need to be. We've got to be proximate to the need, proximate to the community. And so we recently, this past year, came into Third Ward to serve more of our students and have closer proximity to be in the community. So it goes back to that point you made, Shaun, where they're not looking for resources outside of it. The resources are right inside of their community. And one of the things that I often do with our young people is I bring them around our funders. When I'm going out to partnership meetings, I take 2 or 3 of them with me so they can see, here's a Black man walking into a very white space and holding his own, right? So that they too can see that you can also accomplish this, right? Here's how we talk about our work. Here's how I talk about you in the community. I don't talk about you as a deficit, right? You're an asset. Here's what you bring. Despite your challenges, here's the potential that you have. And our kids never hear people talk about them that way. It's like, how do you get these people to donate and give to us and really believe that we can be successful? I said, because you can. And I believe that, right? And so even in the environment, the learning environment that they're in, it doesn't look like I'm sending the message that I believe you belong in prison, or I don't think there's many opportunities for you to be successful in life. When you walk inside of an alternative school, the minute you walk inside of the school, you know that this is for kids who have done something wrong, or the school is sending the message that you do not belong in a traditional school setting. And that's problematic, because if you're sending me here to help me make better decisions moving forward, this is not the way to do it, right? You've confirmed what you believe about me and my potential, and kids can see that right through that. And so I think for me, anytime we're bringing in partners, I really try to find partners of color who have reached levels of success, can identify with our students,
Yes,
show them a way, right? I look at, a lot of my mentors. I started my career on Wall Street, and a lot of my mentors were Black men, right? And they showed me the way. They showed, here's the expectation, here's the bar, and I know you can not only meet it, but exceed it, right? But I'm also going to give you the support that you need and the guidance to get you there. I'm not going to just tell you, go get it, and there's no roadmap, because we know kids on the other side of the bridge are getting the roadmap from the time they're born, right? And some of them don't have to work as hard as our kids to get to that level of success. And so all of these conversations I have with our kids about how I want them to be socially aware of how the world perceives them and what they need to do on their own to be prepared for what's coming, right? Because you're not going to have Mr. P always being your protector. At some point, I'm going to push you out there, and you got to be ready to survive. And a lot of them have that resilience. They're born with it, right? point example, one of my kids, he's a graduate, Tyreek Miles. Tyreek, since the age of 13, has been living on the street, right? Grew up, mom's an addict, dad has been in and out of prison. He calls himself Jungle Boy, right? The other day I was getting on him. I was like, why did you go get a tattoo called Jungle Boy? He's like, Mr. P, there's a meaning behind it, right? And as he sits down and he talks to me, he's like, yeah, you look at it as, this is just another thing that, people are going to judge me on, but it has a personal meaning to how I survived. To get to where I am today, to sit in front of you as a former member of the Crips, and also now going on to Alabama A&M in the fall, I had to survive. And my world was the jungle. It was the street, right? And so a 13-year-old navigating his life through the streets, becoming a father at 15 years of age, right? So all of the things that he'd gone through, he said, I put this on my arm so that it serves as a reminder when I'm feeling low, when I'm feeling down, when I feel I can't do it, I look at this and say, I can, because I'm not supposed to be here. I remember when he got accepted into college, like he literally almost sat down and started crying. He's like, Mr. P, I'm having a moment. He was like, this ain't supposed to how my life's supposed to end. I'm not supposed to be experiencing going to college. Like the fact that he went through our program, ended up getting accepted into college, was the reason why the judge gave him a 90-day sentence in Harris County instead of the 15 years that he was facing, because the judge saw him in a different way. He said, oh, you're going to school. You're actually going to be a productive member of society, right? And so that second chance was extended. And so I think for me, I'm just intentional about oversaturating our kids around Black and brown excellence. You gotta see power, right? When they look at me, they see power, right? I'm not working for somebody. I'm the boss, right? And the boss looks like me, right? And the boss is creating these opportunities for me to be successful that they assume is only exclusive to kids that don't look like them. So I think that it's just, one of the things I really want to really do is really show the beauty and the power that exists in our communities. Our kids shouldn't have to leave. I shouldn't have had to leave South Jamaica, Queens to go get a better education, right? But we don't have that leadership that is committed to staying in our communities and building them up, because when we get ours, we leave and we don't pour back into the communities and the young ones that are coming up after us. So, I'll get off my soapbox, but I can go on this.
No, man. This is what this is for. And I just have so much appreciation for you both, and just being sincere, being very incredibly sincere with how we've arrived. And yes, to everything you've said, and in the remaining time, I will try to offer something in addition. And I will also try to be as generous as you both have been in your own personal biographies. Marvin, I know who Joe Marino is. I played for the Queens Falcons. So I know Joe. I know the intention there. I know all the work. I know all the effort. So I start very much as an 11-year-old in playing borough football, Pop Warner football with some of the roughest kids in New York City, with Joe, Greg Hoffman, Steve Hoffman, may he rest in peace, Tim Kavanaugh, 4 white coaches. Moved to a high school, all-boy Jesuit high school. All my teachers were white male priests. There was a group of young, boys, young men of color that are blowing up my phone right now, where we started with maybe 18, 20 of us, only about 10 or 12 of us graduated. Because it was so hard to be in that environment and see possibility for ourselves, because it seemed so set up for someone that did not look like us. And yet some of us strived. Some of us made through it. Then went to a college with even fewer people of color around me. I being one of 2 players of color on the football team the only person of color in the visual arts department, no professors of color. And so, absolutely, Dr. Lee, absolutely, Marvin, I try to be that person in the lives of these young people, the person that I did not have. And I've since have had mentors that have quite honestly saved my life. Mentors, men of color, women of color that have saved my life ever since. And so I try to be that person. And yet I will still acknowledge that in their lives, they have family members dying from the pandemic. They have an education system that has failed them entirely. They have arresting officers that still stop them in the street. That they have very little to go to in terms of food in their homes. That they are trying to hold down a job, show up to our space, sometimes take care of siblings, sometimes take care of children, and still somehow show up. And so I think it's important for us as we leave the space to say, and I will speak for myself, that I'm grown in my awareness that for those young people, these young people that I care for, I don't look like success. I might be an example of it. And I sure damn will do all in my power and my time and effort to model that. But I would rather throw out that word and say instead, you know what? I will just keep failing with you. Because if you want to find possibility, yes, maybe I'm a model of quote unquote success, but I think you can also find it in each other. And I think that comes back to something that you're saying, Marvin, and you, Dr. Lee. I will do my damnedest to get the resources and put them on the table. I might not be the thing that you look up to. Maybe it's the other person right next to you that is winning. And maybe we can rise up together as a community. Because every time we experience failure, there's an opportunity to come back into that community and define success, not as an individual, but together. And that's a very different framework, that I try to instill in these young people, that you can find everything that you need to live a full life, a life full of joy, a life full of that beautiful struggle in one another. And that maybe that helps you visualize all the necessary steps to whatever it is that you want to come next. And so y'all, go for it.
You asked us to think about failure, and I thought about that, and I can recall giving speeches to students and all, and we always talked about failure and gave examples of successful people, and it was always defined as a step in a process, developing the light bulb, failed I don't know how many times, and then failure was a learning process. However, with respect to people who the prevailing society and whatever system, they try to take people who encounter the criminal justice system, rightly or wrongly, and then they try to take away the second chances and the learning aspect of it by not giving second chances, by putting certain rules around that. And I think those of us who care about this need to work with others to remove those kinds of rules. They used to talk on television about paying your debt to society, but as Michelle Alexander's book shows and other things, once you get in that system, there's no such thing as completely paying your debt and being free of it. And you just get encircled into a system where they have created other barriers and fences around you, and make it difficult to really have a true second chance, to take advantage of that failure, that learning experience. And I think if we can create those real second chances where people can learn from whatever mistakes, like the judge, right, frankly, Marvin, I'm sure it's due to your intervention that then helped create that second chance for that young man. And I think people can learn and will take advantage of second chances who become part of the system. But I think those of us who collectively as a community, as you say, can help break down some of those fences and barriers that are rules that people have set up. The ones that Michelle Alexander talks about, where if you have a felony, you can only get food stamps a certain period and it's cut off, or you can't get certain scholarships. You can't do this. You can't do that. And most of them are illogical. They're only logical if you don't want people to have a second chance and you don't want people to be successful, even though they spend some time in incarcerated or some kind of confinement. And sometimes when I'm in a cynical mood, I think of a young girl who in a summer program in New York, she wrote, I guess it was kind of a little poetic prose thing, and it was called Black People Are Important. And she said, they're important because without them, policemen wouldn't have a job, judges wouldn't have a job, prison guards wouldn't have a job. And she went on down the line. And I thought it was very powerful and sad, because, when we were enslaved, we were property. And then based on, if you think about what the young girls were saying, we were saying we basically the raw material in a whole industry that relies upon bodies being processed and then let out, confined. And because we don't have real second chances, then they get reprocessed. It's like you're growing crop, and so anyway, I don't know if that's upbeat or not. We got to help create real second chances for those who get caught up in it, whether it's their fault or not their fault. Other people have those chances. I know some colleagues who don't look like me who tell me about some of the challenges with their kids, and their young kids are apt to do foolish things or make mistakes, but sometimes the police are different. People say, oh, okay, we're gonna let you go. You get a second chance, get a second chance. Anyway.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Marvin, any parting words?
I just think there's a lot more work to do. We've got to, come together as a community to support each other and really help. I don't use the word save, rather empower and give more access to our young people to, find their way, because I think that's unique. That's a part of the journey, finding your way. And I think that's important to allow them to have the space to do that. Because when you get stuck, you're the one that's going to have to figure out how do you get out of that, that situation. And so, I just really hope our city in Houston specifically starts to invest more in our young people. As every morning you're turning on the news and it's a crime or it's a shooting and it's involving our young people. That means our young people are not occupying their time in a productive way, and we've got to shift their attention to something that's more productive and is actually going to not only ensure that they're successful in life, but continue to build our communities, which right now needs new life, right? And we need the new energy for our young people to carry on the legacy that our seniors and our elders have paved the way in many of these communities. And so I hope we as institutions, school communities, businesses, and nonprofits come together to really collectively, jump in on this issue.
Thank you both. And I will just add that no young person chooses to be stuck. we do that to them. And that's a collective we. And it requires so much more than a single program, even a single community, to relieve someone of that stuckness. And what we all need to invest in is the way in which we need to start imagining again, seeing possibility. And that promise, that imagination, that's the responsibility of the three of us and everyone else listening. And certainly all the institutions, all the systems at play. Because a young person didn't decide to be stuck. And so we need to fight. We need to fight, and we need to instill a fight, and we need to give not only a second chance, but a third chance, a fourth chance, a fifth chance, whatever it is that is required. Because through an abolitionist lens, we talk about, we imagine, we strategize, we implement not only the removal of systems that cause harm and violence in our lives, but replacing those systems with networks of care and accountability being all of our responsibilities for all these young people. No one's left out of that responsibility. So thank you, y'all. Thank you, Dr. Lee. Thank you, Mr. Pierre. Thank you, University of Houston, for creating this space. Thank you all for invisibly joining us as we muse over our work, our practice, and impossibility.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaun. And I just want to add some added thanks to all of our panelists tonight. Thank you for truly and sincerely for sharing your experiences, your stories, your insights, and your perspective. Thank you, Dr. Lee and Marvin, for all you do for this community. Thank you, Shaun, for what you bring to your community. And thank you, Shaun, for convening this discussion and allowing us to shine a greater light on what is happening here. I want to encourage everyone to participate in Shaun's project, but even more importantly, participate in your communities and support organizations like this and help us build collectively. We are so proud to be able to offer this platform to share these stories, and we just hope that we can contribute in a greater way. For everyone that's tuned in tonight, I also want to call your attention that we are in the midst of trying to program another dialogue with Shaun. We don't want to let him go too soon or too easily. So please stay tuned. We're hoping to confirm and finalize that and get the dates out. But for tonight, I sincerely want to thank all of you and just pass it to Melissa to just add a few added notes.
Yes, thank you as well. I wanted to bring up this scholarship, which the College of the Arts is launching this year in an attempt to support these communities with a resource in the College of the Arts. It's a scholarship to students in zip codes 77004, 77021, and 77003. One of those communities is the Third Ward, as well as some other communities identified that don't have as many resources. And one of the things I want to bring up about our conversation in the committee today was that if anyone is considering a scholarship in the arts, that there is a waiver that has been passed since COVID of the ACT and the SAT. We discussed how this is very hopeful because we know that test really creates a barrier for students who don't have access to the resources for those kind of, test prep. And that test is going to be discontinued, hopefully permanently. And we are hopeful for that because it will allow more students to access the arts. And so I leave you with that. And again, thank you so much for this wonderful candor tonight. It was very moving.
And I do want to add too that we will, on both the Mitchell Center website and Blaffer websites, we will add a link where you can donate to 8 Million Stories. We want to support this organization and do all that we can. So thank you, Marvin. Thank you again, Dr. Lee. Thank you, Shaun, so much. And we hope to see all of you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.